If you've ever found yourself just, staring out your kitchen window, watching a small bird snatch a seed from a feeder, you've taken part in one of the world's most common human-wildlife interactions.
Hmm.
It feels so small and personal, almost like a secret connection to nature, right?
It does, but it's that personal connection, multiplied millions and millions of times. That's what makes this phenomenon so huge.
Yeah.
Our sources for this deep dive frame this whole thing not as simple conservation, but as a supplementary feeding experiment on a global scale.
A global experiment.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And we're going to compare what's happening in the northern and southern hemispheres to really get at the hidden ecological rules that we, the people with the feeders, are actually writing.
And when we first looked at the scale of this, the numbers were, they were genuinely hard to grasp.
Right.
Take the UK, over 60% of households are regularly feeding birds. That adds up to people spending somewhere between 188 and 226 million US dollars
Every year.
every single year on 60,000 tons of birdseed.
And that's just the UK. That's sort of our baseline. You cross over to the US, and the scale just becomes monumental.
Okay.
The 2011 National Survey found that 73% of households, that's over 52 million households, are participating.
73%.
And they spend an estimated $4 billion a year just on seed.
Just on the seed.
And then another, $10 billion on all the hardware, the feeders, the baths, all the extra stuff.
Okay, let's unpack this. That adds up to a staggering 500,000 tons of food. 500,000 metric tons.
Yeah.
Being deliberately put into the North American environment every year. That's not a snack. That's an ecological force.
It's an enormous force. The sources calculate that's enough seed to theoretically feed 300 million chickadees for an entire year if they ate nothing else.
That's wild.
Exactly. When you put that much energy into a natural food web, you are guaranteed to shift things in a big way. So our mission today is to move past the feel-good part and actually explore the consequences.
Right. How does it change behavior? What about disease? And how does it fundamentally restructure the whole bird community in our neighborhoods?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about the history and geography of this, because it seems the roots of the practice are totally different depending on whether you're, above or below the equator.
They really are. The whole tradition started in northwestern Europe,
Ah,
and it was explicitly tied to welfare, to helping birds get through those long, harsh winters.
it was an act of survival aid.
Well, a simple act of survival aid, yeah. And that historical link still shapes the behavior today. Outside of, say, the UK and Germany, feeding in most of Northern Europe is still a winter-only thing.
It's seen as a seasonal tool.
Exactly. And it's interesting, it's largely a Western world practice.
Mm.
The sources point out that this kind of intentional feeding is almost unheard of in large parts of Asia, China, Japan.
With one exception, right? In India?
Yeah, the main exception is the ritual of Bhuti Yajna, which involves daily offerings like rice cakes to birds and other animals. But that's a ritualistic act, not just backyard feeding.
Okay, so now let's look south. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Their big cities just don't have those severe cold winters.
No, they don't. And yet the feeding rates are still remarkably high. 63% in Australia and somewhere between 36 and 57% in New Zealand.
So if it's not about winter survival, what's the driver?
It's more about that cultural connection and a sense of care. The practice is largely year-round, and it can actually ramp up during other challenging times, like heat waves or droughts.
So it's driven more by a desire to nurture and just see the birds.
Exactly.
And that difference in culture and climate leads to a really striking difference in the birds themselves. Let's talk about size.
Okay.
In the northern hemisphere, the visitors are tiny, usually from the Parrottae family, tits, chickadees.
Super light, maybe 15, 20 grams.
Right. Even the heaviest common birds at a feeder are only around 110, 120 grams.
And here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the species in the southern hemisphere, that dynamic just flips entirely. You're not just feeding small seed eaters. You're feeding large, dominant species.
Give us some examples of these heavyweights.
Well, a common sight at an Australian feeder is the Australian magpie, which weighs in at 212 to 360 grams.
So already double or triple the size.
Easily.
Yeah.
And the undisputed champion is the sulfur-crested cockatoo, a huge parrot that can be a massive 790 grams.
Nearly a kilogram.
Almost a kilogram a bird.
Yeah.
That's more than 40 times the mass of a North American chickadee showing up at your feeder.
A bird that big has a totally different ecological presence, doesn't it? The competition for food must be incredibly
It
fierce.
is. And when these large, often aggressive species like cockatoos dominate a food source, the smaller, maybe shyer native species just get pushed out.
So we're not just supplementing a diet, we're actively, what, subsidizing the success of the most competitive birds in that community?
That's exactly what's happened.
And I guess those different birds are being fueled by very different menus. It's not just sunflower seeds down there.
Not at all. In Australia, especially, the dietary supplements can be pretty
What do you
extreme.
mean?
Meat. Because the species are larger and often omnivorous, meat is routinely fed to magpies, butcher birds, kookaburras.
What kind of meat are we talking about?
The sources say raw beef mince is the most common, but also, pieces of sausage, ham, chicken scraps.
Wow, so we're giving processed human food directly to wild birds.
Hmm.
That's a whole other level of intervention.
And it's driving some incredible changes. The most extreme example from the research is the rainbow lorikeet.
Okay.
Naturally, this is a highly specialized nectar feeder. That's what it does. But in these urban areas, with these subsidies, they've actually learned to eat and process those meat supplements.
So a nectar eater is learning to eat meat. That is a massive, unnatural expansion of its niche.
Driven entirely by us.
But regardless of where you are or what you're feeding them, the human motivation seems pretty similar, right? Why do we do it?
Yeah, studies in both the UK and Australia show it comes down to really powerful psychological benefits. People feel relaxed, they feel connected to nature.
A sense of pleasure, of nurturing something.
Exactly. It boosts their environmental awareness and their own psychological well-being.
So it's a net positive for the person doing the feeding, but the social view of it is very different. In the UK, it's widely promoted.
It is. But in Australia, there's a lot of public pushback from conservation groups. They're worried about disease, about competition with native birds.
And that makes people reluctant to even talk about it.
Yeah, there's a common reluctance to discuss it publicly, even though their personal reasons for doing it are exactly the same as someone in the UK.
Okay, so one of the main concerns is always dependency. Are we creating bird populations that can't survive without us? The science seems, well, it seems nuanced.
It is. There are definitely clear examples of full reliance. Tits in Finland, for instance, they need that supplementary food to survive the winter. Same with Anna's hummingbirds in British Columbia, using heated sugar feeders in the cold.
So in extreme conditions, it's a lifeline.
It's an absolute lifeline.
But for most species, is it more of a buffer?
That seems to be the case. Most birds visit sporadically. Their diet is still mostly natural stuff. A study on Australian magpies showed they kept feeding their nestlings natural foods, even with tons of human food available.
And there was that fascinating long-term study, right, on black-capped chickadees in Wisconsin. They were fed for 25 years.
25 years, yeah. And that study found that the fed chickadees had identical survivorship rates to the unfed populations nearby.
So a quarter century of free food didn't make them weaker.
It suggests that for a lot of these resilient species, the feeders act as a critical resource buffer, not a total replacement. But even if they're not fully dependent, that easy food still dramatically changes how they live.
You mean those carryover effects?
Precisely. Food in one season influences what happens in the next. For instance, feeding blue tits in the UK through the winter resulted in them having more successful fledglings in the spring.
They just started the breeding season stronger.
Healthier and stronger. And we also see it altering fundamental behaviors, like migration.
Right, some birds are changing their routes or just not leaving at all.
Yep, Eurasian blackcaps, white storks. When a reliable food source is there all winter, the whole risk-reward calculation of flying south just changes.
And this can even get down to complex social behaviors, like mating strategies. The sources mentioned a study on blue tits and extra pair paternity.
Right, EPP. That's the proportion of chicks in a nest, fathered by a male who isn't the social partner.
Okay.
So to simplify, in areas without extra food, when females laid larger clutches of eggs, which is a high investment, the proportion of those chicks from extra pair fathers was higher.
So high investment from her meant she sought out better genes from outside the pair bond.
That's one theory. But here's the twist. When food was provided, that relationship completely broke down. It just disappeared. The number of extra pair young was no longer linked to the number of eggs.
So the hypothesis is
Yeah.
that the extra food lets the male guard his mate better, or the female sees her well-fed partner as higher quality now.
It's complex. But either way, we are effectively messing with evolutionary pressures right in our backyards just by putting out some seeds.
Okay, let's move on to the really serious impacts because we have to talk about disease. If dependency is nuanced, this part is not.
No, it's not. The sources are crystal clear on this. The fundamental problem is concentration. Feeders are like busy social hubs.
They bring birds together that might not normally interact.
Exactly. In small, high-traffic areas, it's just the perfect setup for pathogens to spread.
And we saw this play out in the U.S. in the mid-90s with the house finch disease.
A really virulent form of conjunctivitis, yeah. It spread like wildfire across the eastern U.S., and it led to a one-third population decline in house finches.
And the spread was actually tracked by citizen scientists, right, through Project Feeder Watch.
It was, and researchers found the bacteria could stay alive on damp feeders, so the feeders themselves became these persistent vectors for transmission.
Wow. And a similar thing happened in the UK.
A very similar catastrophe, yeah. In 2005 and 2006, with finch trichomoniasis, it's a nasty bacterial infection.
And the effect was just as devastating.
It caused a 35% decline in the British greenfinch population in a single year. Again, tracked by citizen scientists with the Garden Birdwatch program.
And the suspected source of that is fascinating. It came from wood pigeons.
Yeah, the disease was known in rural wood pigeons. But wood pigeons have become more and more urbanized, drawn in by the exact seed feeders we're talking about.
So we created a magnet that drew in a carrier species.
Who then introduced a lethal pathogen into a crowded community of smaller birds. It's a perfect example of how our intervention can bridge ecological gaps that shouldn't be bridged.
And beyond these huge disease outbreaks, feeding acts as this constant ecological force just restructuring entire bird communities.
Right. We saw this perfectly in a study from Auckland, New Zealand. When they provided supplementary food, the whole community changed. Introduced species, like house sparrows and spotted doves, their numbers went way up. While native species, like the little gray gerygone, their numbers went way down.
And the most critical finding from that study
was that the community switched right back to normal within a few weeks after they stopped the feeding.
So the subsidy is like a powerful lever. You pull it, the system changes. You let go, it snaps back.
Exactly. It's not creating a new permanent ecosystem.
Yeah.
And the general finding across all the research is really consistent on this point.
Which is?
Feeder density increases the overall abundance of birds, the total number, but it does not increase their species richness or diversity.
It just favors a few highly competitive species that can dominate that resource.
Often introduced species, yeah. The bullies win.
So, given that cities are only going to get more crowded, this practice is likely to intensify, which means the research needs to get really targeted.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, one of the huge research questions is about the idea of ecological traps.
Okay, what exactly is an ecological trap?
It's when an environmental cue that used to signal a high-quality habitat now it leads to bad decisions, maladaptive behaviors.
And in this case, the cue is a feeder full of food.
A massive cue of resource availability. So birds flock to the city thinking, this place is great, look at all this food.
But the city itself is full of other danger.
Exactly. The food is great, but now you're exposed to pollution, cats, cars, window collisions, and those disease outbreaks we just talked about.
So if the city attracts more birds than it can successfully raise, it becomes what's called a sink.
A population sink. It's losing more individuals than it produces, and our good intentions could be contributing to that dynamic.
And with the constant disease risk, we need better surveillance, right? We can't just wait for an outbreak.
We need widespread surveillance of the feeders themselves. Researchers in New Zealand, for example, found salmonella on about 7% of the feeding structures they tested.
So the risk is it's always there at a low level.
It's always present. And managing that means we need to build a better relationship with the public to encourage simple, hygienic practices. It's not just about putting food out. It's about doing it responsibly.
And to answer all these complex questions, the science needs to embrace, both technology and citizen collaboration.
Definitely. Things like stable isotope analysis, or SIA.
How does that work?
It's incredibly clever. You analyze the isotopes, different versions of atoms, in a bird's feathers or tissues. And that lets you reconstruct exactly what it's been eating.
So you can tell how much is natural food versus human handouts.
You get a hard metric of how much of that 500,000 tons of seed is actually ending up in the birds.
And what about tracking them at the feeder?
For that, the research calls for more PIT tags, passive integrated transponders.
Like the microchips in pets.
Exactly.
Okay.
You can put automated readers on the feeders and track individual visits, how long they stay, who they interact with. It gives you the super detailed data you need to model disease spread and community dynamics.
So the real takeaway here is that garden bird feeding has this profound dual nature. It's incredibly positive for our own well-being, for our connection to nature.
Absolutely. But at the same time, it's a global ecological force that's dictating community structure, spreading disease, and changing the life history of these animals. We're the biggest force shaping urban bird life today.
And that sheer intensity of the interaction, especially with those huge, often introduced species in the southern hemisphere, it forces you to think about the trade-offs. The fact that a 790-gram cockatoo in Australia or a rose-ringed parakeet in Europe is dominating these feeders, it raises a serious question.
Yeah.
Is this popular activity ultimately benefiting native biodiversity? Or is it just fundamentally favoring the dominance of aggressive, non-native urban winners in the long run?
That's the big question we're left with.
So what does this all mean? We hope this deep dive encourages you to consider the complexity of your own local human-wildlife interactions. Keep learning, keep watching, and maybe keep those feeders clean.